I remember vividly, sitting in this hotel room and texting my mom and telling her that I needed money for food because I wouldn't get my first paycheck for about 2 weeks. And she and my dad, so unbelievably supportive of me, came by the hotel and dropped money off. And they came up to the door and slid the money, under the door. Little did they know that I was still in the hotel room, sitting on the bed, so they couldn't see me or hear me, staying completely, quiet. And they thought I was at work, and I wasn't. And, I waited until they left the hotel. I looked out the window, watched them walk to their car, and drive away. And then I hopped off the bed, grabbed the money, ran downstairs, around the corner to the liquor store, grabbed as much alcohol as I could, went back to the room and just drank myself, to sleep basically. And, from there it was about, it's like the snap of a finger, like 10 years went by until I went to rehab again. Honestly, I had a very normal, if you want to call it that, upbringing. Like, I have great parents. I have one brother, he's 3 years older than me. I had a pretty great childhood. I got everything I wanted for Christmas. I remember every year, like, my parents would always have a big present waiting for us in our basement. We got a ping pong table one year, Nintendo 64 another year, PlayStation 2. It was great, man. I think I started to rebel a little bit once I, got to high school. I joined a band. We played really loud, hardcore music, and I started drinking and using drugs. And I don't know, as soon as I had my first drink, as soon as I took my first drug, I just felt like I belonged to something, and I just took it as far as I could, and I'll be honest, I had a lot of fun drinking alcohol and using drugs for a long time, until I didn't, and at one point, after I graduated college, I got into a lot of trouble. While I was in college, I got 2 DUIs. I almost got expelled from school. Somehow I was able to graduate, with a pretty good GPA. I think my work ethic has always been pretty strong, so I can keep my parents, and people in my life off my back, so I could continue to drink and use drugs without distraction. But once I graduated, all my friends got jobs, stopped drinking every single night. I got a job, but I continued to drink and, do drugs pretty much daily, and I was able to keep that up for years and years and years. And, eventually I ended up going to rehab in my mid-20s because I got caught doing drugs in my parents' house. And I wasn't ready to stop. I went through a month of inpatient rehab and moved to a recovery house. My parents essentially forced me. If I didn't go, I was gonna be, kicked out of the house. I knew I drank a lot more than other people. I usually blacked out every time I drank, but, I was not too far removed from college. I thought this is what people did, like still had fun, especially on weekends. But the problem with me is I was drinking on weeknights, almost every single day, and doing drugs whenever I could, pretty much daily as well. But, I got caught using drugs in my parents' house. My mom was pissed, rightfully so. My brother was concerned about me, and they kind of gave me an ultimatum, like, you need to go to rehab or you're gonna need to look for another place to live. So I ended up going to rehab, and I actually participated. I got engaged, I went to all the groups. I talked to people. I remember there was a kid there that played guitar. We played some music together. But there was just something in the back of my mind that was waiting for the moment that I got out so that I could go back and start drinking and doing drugs again. So I wasn't allowed back home despite going to rehab. You know, my mom and dad forced me to move into a recovery house in Levittown, and I was pissed. I hated it. Like I made sure that they knew that I hated it as well. So I moved into the recovery house, back into my parents' good graces. I convinced them that I got a job, you know, and to allow me to come home. And I did get a job, you know, for about a day so that I could get the orientation paperwork so I could show my parents, hey, mom and dad, I got a job. Here's proof. You know, I remember vividly, you know, sitting in this hotel room and texting my mom and telling her that I needed money for food because I wouldn't get my first paycheck for about 2 weeks. And she and my dad, so unbelievably supportive of me, you know, came by the hotel and dropped money off. And they came up to the door and slid the money, you know, under the door. Little did they know that I was still in the hotel room, sitting on the bed, so they couldn't see me or hear me, staying completely, you know, quiet. And they thought I was at work, you know, and I wasn't. And, you know, I waited until they left the hotel. I looked out the window, watched them walk to their car, you know, and drive away. And I hopped off the bed, grabbed the money, ran downstairs, you know, around the corner to the liquor store, you know, grabbed as much alcohol as I could, went back to the room and just drank myself, you know, to sleep basically. And, you know, from there it was about, I mean, it's like the snap of a finger, like 10 years went by until I went to rehab again. And that 10 years, like, it really was terrible. So I was in Phoenixville Hospital, you know, because I was drinking so much and in such bad physical pain. You know, I thought I had cirrhosis of the liver. I thought I had pancreatitis. I thought, you know, I was gonna need a new liver. I had no idea, but I was admitted to the hospital, and, you know, after talking with my parents, I knew I was gonna need to go to rehab. I knew I was gonna need some type of treatment. So, you know, I'm so blessed that I have such a supportive family through all the crap that I put them through. My brother, Brian, who's 3 years older than me, actually started Googling, you know, alcohol addiction treatment, and Pennsylvania Recovery Center, you know, came up, and, you know, he sent me the number, and I was so out of it. I was like, whatever, just you guys tell me what to do. I couldn't make any decisions, you know, and my brother sent me the number. I called, and I remember vividly Brant answering the phone, and it's kind of funny. You know, he was like, man, you sound pretty desperate, you know. And I was like, geez, all right. Like, yeah, I do, you know, and come to find out, like, that was probably for the best, because if I wasn't so desperate, who knows if I would have continued to take any suggestions that people were giving me or follow through with the treatment. I was in the worst place in my life, and to have people welcome me because of that is a very tricky thing to wrap your head around, but it just made it so much easier. I didn't need to worry about making any decisions. All I needed to do was answer questions, be open-minded, be honest, and willing to do what they say. Coming to groups here, like, I'm able to have awareness of my behaviors now. You know, I really thought when I stopped drinking that all my problems would go away. You know, I thought alcohol was my problem. When I stopped drinking, things actually started to get worse. You know, I couldn't think straight. You know, I was depressed. I was anxious because I didn't have alcohol anymore. You know, and they taught me that here in group, and, you know, I learned a lot of ways to change my behaviors and change my thinking, which has changed my life. I have the freedom to live my life. It means freedom to enjoy my days. You know, I try not to get too far ahead of myself. I try to take it one day at a time, and that just makes it so much easier. You know, and I find I don't feel the need to drink or do drugs. and I love life. And I never thought in a million years I would say that.